please welcome Eric Howeler of Howeler Yoon Architecture.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting us back. We've enjoyed coming to Columbus and getting to know the sites and the people in the community, learning about the amazing design culture that you have here. And it's really an honor and a privilege to propose something in this context. Our site was the first Christian church, the same as Chris's. Our first impressions of coming here, obviously, from the East Coast, we're from above, sort of looking down on the landscape. I think a lot of people experience this landscape like this, and looking down and seeing the kind of infinite extension of this grid was one of the most powerful kind of impressions that we had. Recognizing the kind of Jeffersonian grid as a sort of system for subdividing, cultivating, distributing, communicating, connecting in a way that's rational, partitionable, democratic, and how that sort of enters into the city. I think the city fabric is so much an extension and a kind of microcosm of that sort of territorial scale. Looking at the site along Fifth Street, not Fifth Avenue, we were impressed by how the street grid sort of continues through, and this kind of image of this kind of iconic sort of Midwest town with this sort of equal grid, equal in all directions. And the Main Street and how the people sort of interact on Main Street and how they gather on Main Street, but also on Fifth Street, and how this set of buildings isn't just a set of individual buildings, but they're actually creating a space between them. And I think that's what we sort of learned, was it wasn't just one iconic building and another iconic building, but it's the sort of the spaces between. Thinking about how the buildings sort of were placed and how Saarinen placed the building here. The building is in dialogue with the library, and that's about making place. How do you make place within a grid? The grid is sort of democratic, it sort of runs off the edges, but how do you sort of arrest that grid and how do you disrupt that? So the closing of the street to sort of imply that plaza in between there was such an incredible urban move, not just an architectural move. That's a dialogue between the Saarinen building and the Pei building, something we learned by coming and spending time and talking to people here about what's special about this. It's not just buildings, it's actually the space between. Looking at some of the plans, we see that there was a proposal to close that grid even further, to kind of create one quadrant with three quadrants sort of connected, which was kind of amazing. So that implied plaza and the relationships between them. And then the sculpture, so Henry Moore sculpture, sort of sitting here at the end of that street, rotating the view around in dialogue with the church on an oblique. So we realized that the sculpture, that Henry Moore sculpture, is really a kind of viewing device. It's a viewing device to look through it at the church. We've been talking to people here about the different kinds of relationships, and talking with Kelly, just looking at the dialogue between the architecture, the center line of this, the alignment of that column and that pier. These are architects that are engaging in a kind of dialogue across landscape with art. So that kind of completeness of the space. Looking carefully, you see the kind of center line alignments and misalignments. Standing there, you see straight down the concrete joint in the sidewalk. You look right up between those two columns, and in the library there's a third column that sort of closes that gap. So it's very, very precise, deliberate architectural move. So we realize that it's really about these alignments and these dialogues between the buildings. So again, a kind of centering and the edges of buildings and the center lines of buildings. I think we also detected a lot of deliberate architectural moves here, looking through the Moore at the church. So it's really this kind of implied plaza between the buildings that are in dialogue. And we said the plaza is a kind of web of relationships between buildings in dialogue, but it's also a kind of urban living room. It's where people gather. And how people gather in this space, and it's really about the people that can gather in this space. So it's not just the architecture, it's really the community that comes together here. And this is something that we've been very interested in our architecture, in our design. How do we design places for people to gather, to create what we call the public realm? So we say the public realm is it's social, it's surprising, it's spontaneous, it's mixed use, it's playful, and it's super mediated. So these are things that we've looked at a lot in our work. And I wanted to show you some of the projects we've done before, just to sort of give you a sort of context for what we're talking about. In 2001, my partner designed this defensible dress, which was a circuit board, sensors, and a kind of actuator. So it's architectural in that it's private space in the public realm. And so, how do we use technology to create an architecture that is about private space in the public realm? We used the same technology for a project we did in Athens in 2004 for the Olympics, which was a field of fiber optic lights that sort of responded to the viewer and created a trail of light and sound, so it had a white noise and a white light. So this is our first project, kind of immaterial project about light and effect, but really about how people use public space. Another project we did in Boston, it's a set of swings for everybody, not just for kids. And the swings have an accelerometer in them. And so when you swing, the light changes color because the accelerometer knows when it's tilting, it goes pink and it goes blue. And so it creates a kind of feedback loop for the swinger to, if they needed any help, to know that they're swinging and to sort of encourage a kind of social behavior. So these are simple projects that activate space, that bring people together in a playful way, using technology to sort of enhance those experiences, to provide some sort of feedback. And in our shop, we do fabricate a lot of components, material, lighting, acoustic. We've been interested in energy. How do we sort of make this off the grid, bringing people together, creating behaviors that were unexpected. We tried to codify those with some rules, and quickly found that nothing we could do could stop the way people behave. So this is a kind of lesson for us as architects. We can design whatever we want, but people will behave them in the way that they want to behave. And so how do we encourage that? How do we coax that? How do we try to design for that? One more project that might be relevant, we just built this memorial at MIT at the site of the police officer that was killed at MIT. And Boston responded with Boston Strong, MIT Strong, and we said, what is strength? What is strength and memory? And so we proposed a structure that was explicitly about a kind of absence, a kind of carved figure where there's an absent figure, and that formed an arch. It formed a vault made of solid blocks of stone. And so how do we create a place of memory, a place where someone can come and gather, and also see themselves as a kind of relationship to a larger part, a part within a larger whole. And then the vault was a great metaphor for a community coming together to build something where every part is necessary to produce equilibrium, to produce the structure. So from strength to structure, we did a lot of quarry visits to find the material, to cut the stone, to assemble it in a way that produced that figural void, that's conspicuous absence. So on the MIT campus, it's a new memorial. It's also a gateway into MIT. And so this was resonating with us and the Henry Moore, and how do we sort of make place, make it a sense of openness, a sense of siting and alignment, but also a place for people to gather. So coming to Columbus, which is where we are and what we're talking about today, we looked very carefully at the church and the library together, how they interacted. And we were struck by these markings on the buildings. I don't know if you noticed them. They're quite subtle. The primary reading is this sort of unadorned box, very modern. But very quickly we noticed these kind of inscriptions that we kept asking, what are they? How do you explain this? But they were sort of everywhere, these kind of threads that would sort of, you'd find them wrapped around a stone block or wrapped around a column. Even in the window panes, there's a kind of irregular, inexplicable complexity that's built in across mediums. So the mullions, the brickwork, the limestone, these patterns were manifested across mediums around the church. And this seemed to be a kind of signature, a kind of clue. So we inquired with our historian friends and asked, what does this mean? Where is Elio in the sort of trajectory of modernism, a kind of proto-modernism with a trace of craft and handmadeness? Larry was kind enough to send us lots of quotes and interpretations. Does this refer to a kind of timelessness, a kind of Egyptian moment, a kind of basic condition? Tricia was helpful in providing references to other Saarinen buildings that had some of these markings. So it was a series of clues And David, who's an architectural historian at Yale, was talking about how these flourishes create a kind of human scale and something that's actually much, much larger. So we were thinking about Saarinen, Eliel, and what could he have been thinking? We're trying to get into his head. And looking at this picture, he seems to be challenging us to sort of try to figure it out. He provided clues. And so we took the bait. We looked at his architecture, both in Finland and in the United States, the kind of Finnish national romanticism, a kind of transitional style between a kind of local tradition and a kind of more international or global. We looked at his work in Chicago, his #2 entry for the Chicago Herald Tribune competition. We looked at his work at Cranbrook, and we found clues and hints and traces, a kind of austere proto-modernism with a kind of flourish, a kind of tactility, a kind of intricacy that we do see at the First Christian Church. We do know he collaborated with many other designers, with Charles Eames, with his son, at Cranbrook, creating a school and a place where crafts were sort of brought together. Even on this structure, there's a kind of weave on that column that's just that little bit of a clue. The building is so austere, but there's that little sort of woven line on the doors. It's almost like a kind of tapestry. When you touch it with your hand, you're almost touching that line, creating these continuities and discontinuities. So we were super intrigued. The tapestry from his partner, Loja Saarinen, the weaving, both at the kind of urban scale, at the kind of landscape scale. We have to believe that these are kind of traces from a kind of post-medium or kind of a crossing of a mediums. We even noticed that this icon seems to be his initials. You know, it's a kind of mark or a stamp. So he's sort of signing his name across these structures. So he seems to be asking us to go on a search for form. So we were searching. We searched about his sort of discourse on machine-made versus natural, the role of decoration. We found traces on these photographs of the Egyptian columns. Talk about ornament as a kind of mediator. So he seems to be telling us to keep searching, go for it. So like I said, we took the bait. We looked at this motif on the column, and we sort of unrolled it and sort of figured, well, how does this sort of form a kind of continuity around this structure? We abstracted that pattern and tried to figure out how we could use it as a sort of leaping off point, some sort of genetic material that we could sort of interpret. We then took that and expanded it into a field and saw it as a kind of maybe a one-dimensional leaping to a two-dimensional. So from a line to a plane as a viewing device, a thickened plane, a kind of volumetric condition, almost a kind of foam or a sponge, a thick ornament that became volumetric. And how did light sort of move through it? Looking at the site, we proposed to locate it in front of the grove of trees along the sidewalk so that it could sort of play a game with the Henry Moore, taking an oblique line, bending it in the pavilion and sort of folding it out. So here it is proposed along the sidewalk, along that edge, in the grove of trees, producing a pavilion. We also thought we could make some benches. So these are kind of, this is a prototype. It's kind of like a bed of nails. It may not be comfortable, but it's certainly survivable. We worked with a structural engineer from Stuttgart and New York, Schleich, Bergerman and partners. They suggested that we use earth screws, a kind of reversible, sort of low-impact sort of footing technology. We would introduce oblique spanning plates. From those, we would introduce a secondary set of plates that would tie those together. And then we would suspend down a kind of thickness, thanks, Kelly, an ornamental structure. We looked at the stresses, and we could locally thicken or stiffen the material where the stresses were high. And the result, I think, is a kind of ornamental space, not just a structure. Looking at the sort of perceptions from above, from below, and we're sort of struck by the Saarinen quote, the mediator between line and mass and color and material. So it is a pavilion about line and plane and mass. Thinking about how it's made, I just wanted to show you another project we did out of steel plate. So this is a pavilion out of quarter-inch steel plate we did in Phoenix, recognizing that people inhabit shade in hot climates. So we were struck by the kind of social behavior of people, this is Mexico City, where they line up in the shadow of the flag. And so how do you make place? You have to make shade. Thinking about a parasol at the urban scale, a kind of public parasol, folding steel to create shadows, to create pavilions, using a basic brake to fold the steel, to aggregate it. And we think a similar kind of construction technique could be used to form discontinuous or non-straight line structures in public. So those are the primary lines. That's the plan, so you could certainly move through it. It feels quite open with those 4 kind of feet placed there. The way the shadows move around it over the course of the day, creating different patterns on the ground. So a view looking up through it at the foliage, at the trees, a view from across the street where we sort of pick up on an oblique sort of vista. Think about it in the larger context, looking up through it, through the trees. We have a short little animation. So here we're sort of highlighting the Henry Moore, highlighting its relationship to this pavilion, how they sort of participate in that kind of weave of spaces together, looking up through the trees, thinking about it not just as a shelter, but a viewing device, incorporating the Saarinen into that set of sort of curated views, coming down in a way the nave of the space, and then peeking out to the side and seeing alignments across the street to the Henry Moore, and then back through down the central axis of the pavilion. Okay, so in closing, we think it's been a fantastic opportunity to think about this site and this place, and think about something site-specific that is unique here to Columbus, to the history of Columbus and its legacy of design, but also to sort of push it forward, to create spaces for people to gather, to see themselves as a community, to collaborate, to think about new futures. And I guess the most amazing thing for us has been thinking about Saarinen and thinking how has he sort of taught us something about our own design work. And I guess I concluded this morning that he's telling us that not everything is knowable. We can't know all the things that he's left us with all these clues, but that everything is sort of woven together. And I think that was what we sort of took away from Saarinen. Thank you.
Hi, Eric.
Hey.
Thank you for that beautiful presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about the fabrication of the piece, the material, and I assume that there are components or units are then screwed together or welded together?
Yeah, and we looked into sort of brake-formed aluminum, like anodized aluminum, that we could put on a brake, and we actually, this is foam core, but we actually did talk to a fabricator about brake-forming aluminum. We could certainly produce all the cut files and all the necessary sort of fabrication components. We also talked to some of the local fabricators here, thinking maybe they could help us. It'd be nice to use sort of local fabricators like Noblet in terms of their capacity to sort of break form metal. We would certainly have to sort of calibrate it in terms of density and cost. I think that's something that we'd have to manage very carefully. The benches might be denser than the canopy, just to provide some sittability. Yeah, we thought, I mean, it's not an efficient structure. It's not a straight span, but it's thick enough. So there's a kind of excess of material, but I think it could produce a volumetric condition that we find very spatial and actually quite beautiful. So, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't even prompt you to look at the artifacts. So, this is a. Can I put this down? So this is a kind of abstraction, just a kind of X-rate. So showing a kind of a version of the kind of optimized version. And then this one, just so you guys can all see it, it's the Saarinen one, the kind of non-straight line piece. we do find eventually sort of continuities, but they're not sort of straight.
Miniatures of
Well, I mentioned there are kind of fragments. The kind of reading is that it's a fragment. You know, maybe there's a kind of hollowing and a kind of a selection of that. But we thought it'd be nice to have them underneath and have them move around. So people could sort of gather and move around and adjust them.
let's hope
And these were just studies thinking about how we might, in a previous version, incorporate the trees, so the tree might actually go right through it, thinking that it wants to be part of the grove and not just a kind of standalone thing. So that would require more thought as how it sort of would sort of integrate itself into the grove, and some just study models.
Is this the actual final configuration? This one? So what's the orientation if you're, where's the moor and
So if you look at it in the site model, the moor is looking right at
Goes this way,
the
though, is
steeple.
what you're saying.
Yeah. So the open corner would face
I
the
see.
moor, and I think another oblique might walk right in there and then fold out. So the pavilion sort of does a kind of a V-shaped oblique that we think sort of invites you from across the street and then sort of pushes you out. It's really that kind of weaving that we thought was the discovery here.
So the important axis for you is the moor,
Yeah.
because that signifies a kind of in-between, not only for creating that plaza, but then this becomes the dialogue.
Use a
and the-
microphone, please.
Sorry. I was just asking about not only the dialogue between the project and the Moore sculpture, but also the fact that the alignment between the sculpture and the pavilion is the key alignment. But my question then, Eric, is could this in effect work elsewhere on the site in a different way?
I suppose. I imagine it could slide forward or back. We were really struck by the fact that it's not just architecture here. It is public art. It is landscape. It is actually, you know, the roadbed. All these things are sort of coming together to form this set of relationships here. It could certainly slide that way, maybe address the approach from Washington Street. But we really thought that oblique to the moor was kind of the discovery. You know, it's the kind of unseen alignment that you see it for a moment, you're like, aha, you know, and it kind of clicks together. So these kind of subtle or invisible alignments that we learned about, you don't really see them in plan, but you sort of see them when you experience the site.
ties together, like the historic visitor center, the historic city hall, there's openings at points of each of those as well, right?
Yeah.
Regarding the plan of footprint of the piece, the proportion, the dimensions, and the geometry of it, can you speak to those points?
Yeah, I mean, we tried bigger ones. You know, it's essentially a kind of foam condition that can expand and could be cut. So we sort of expanded the field, and then we sort of cropped a sort of chunk of it. It certainly could move or get adjusted.
But why the very geometric and rectangular footprint?
I mean, I think there is a kind of a lattice, a kind of order to the kind of Saarinen. We wanted to sort of crop it almost on a diagonal, kind of like a Mondrian, you know, on an oblique. So we see the oblique in its sort of selection, sort of cropping boundary. I think it's stronger when it's cropped in a regular figure. I wouldn't want it to be all sort of fuzzy. So that was just a kind of choice to sort of create a kind of almost a cube of foam that we could then hollow.
And am I understanding that you're still exploring materials, but you're committed to metal that is reflective as opposed to something transparent or?
Right, that's just the 3D print. I
Right.
mean, we loved the renderings looking through and seeing the light bounce around in the anodized aluminum. That was, I think, what convinced us about the metal. It also has the capacity to span. We can thicken it as necessary to achieve the spans. I believe it's about 15 feet high, so it's, we wanted to make sure there was enough headroom, certainly to pass through, but we did want to keep it intimate, not something that would be too big, and also just being mindful of the budget.
If you're going to have to use one word to describe this project, this thing to someone who may not have a full understanding of design, is it sculpture? Is it pavilion? Is it architecture, building, bus stop?
I mean, it is a kind of folly. It's a structure without program, so no intended use, but it allows and invites many different uses. So I think, Chris mentioned the way people cut through. It's a kind of shortcut, so it is a kind of path. It's a temporary structure. It's a place to gather. And if I were to use two words, I would say, I think it's a kind of ornamental space. It's a kind of thickness that's sort of somewhere between a kind of a symbol, a line, and a volume. So for us, it was such an enigma this whole time to try to figure out what it was, and then we realized that it wasn't really meant to be resolved.
Thank you.